Friends, peace be with you. This is the second part of the talk, Who Are the Warmongers? In the first part, we had focused upon the region where most of the wars and conflicts have taken place in the last 40 or 50 years, and that's West Asia. In this talk, we shall focus upon the global scenario. In other words, we look at the global arena and look at what's been happening. Who are the warmongers? It is very clear from what we can see, if we are honest and if we are sincere about this, that since the end of the Second World War, that means the last 80 years or so, the major cause of conflicts, of friction, of tension, and of course of wars, the major cause has been US hegemony. That is the major cause. The attempt by the United States to establish hegemony over the world, control over nations, vital waterways, strategic routes, resources, people. That's what they've been trying to do. And as a result of that, you find that there are eruptions, there are wars, because people resist this. They don't want to be subjected to this sort of control and dominance. So hegemony, by which we mean control and dominance, is the root cause. And we can show this very easily if we are honest about the situation. Let's begin with the situation immediately after the Second World War. The first major war was the Korean War, 1950 to 1953. And in the Korean War, as we know, the US, concerned about China and communism. At that time, of course, 1949, China had become communist. Very concerned about this, wanted to stop this tide, what they saw as a threat to the whole world, because they were totally against communism. Why? Because the US is the champion of capitalism. I mean, this is the real reason. So they're very much against communism, and they wanted to stop China's rise. And they felt that given what was happening in Korea, the Chinese would seize the opportunity to expand their influence. There was no hard evidence that the Chinese were doing it. But in any case, they moved in, supported certain groups and so on, and that led to the war. The war within the Korean Peninsula, north and south, backed by different sides. Went on for 3 years, and even though the war has ended, in reality, the US has not signed any armistice, any agreement on the end of the war. And they are, in a sense, saying that the war is still on, if you like, between the US and, Korea. Now, that is an example of a war dictated by hegemony, because the US wanted to stop something which was totally without any basis. Basically, to curb China. China was not attacking anyone. China was not expanding its influence. At the time, it had just had its revolution in 1949. But because they were obsessed with China, they moved in. That's an example. But a much better example of what happened was Vietnam and Indochina. Another major war. And if you look at what had happened, the French, who were the colonial power in Indochina, including Vietnam, they were the colonial overlords. The French were defeated by the Vietnamese, the Indochinese people, the Vietnamese in particular. The reason is very simple, because the Vietnamese, they were part of a nationalist movement. They were part of a struggle to free their country from colonialism. Simple, straightforward. Under Ho Chi Minh, they fought, they struggled, and finally there was a major battle in a place called Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam in 1954. And it's a famous battle in history because the Vietnamese, the nationalists, the people who were fighting for their country, they defeated the French. They defeated the French, and after a short while, the Americans decided to move in because they felt that, oh, now the French have been defeated. Again, same thing, China will expand its influence, very dangerous. We have to get into the picture. And so eventually the involvement became deeper and deeper and deeper. At the beginning, some advisors, and technical assistants and so on. And then very soon afterwards, they sent troops and all that. From the time of John F. Kennedy, actually, even though he was not very keen on it, but people around him, all the so-called experts and advisors and so on, wanted this war. And it became another theater of American involvement in a war in Asia. And the casualties kept increasing at the beginning, small numbers, and then bigger and bigger numbers, tens of thousands. The US, it's true, lost quite a lot of people, but so did the Vietnamese, who were fighting the most sophisticated military power of the day at that time, the United States of America. They didn't have anything. They were called the men in pajamas, the Vietnamese. Simple, rudimentary tools, but they were committed to their land. They were a hell of a big fight, and it became a major issue. Good example of unnecessary war dragged on for a long while from about, let's say, 1960-61 to 1975. A lot of deaths and tremendous damage to the country. The use of Agent Orange, and all the rest of it, how it devastated crops, animals, human beings. And then another major war. This was the war that the US got involved in Afghanistan, the third major war. See, again, miscalculations of this sort, stupid premises on which they started the war. They felt that the Soviet influence was increasing. Of course, the government was closer to the Soviet Union, but it was more at the diplomatic level, at the level of bilateral ties and so on. But the US decided they must get in. They backed the religious groups against the communists in Afghanistan. So all the religious groups actually, at the beginning, they were backed by the US. And they were quite happy, went for trips to the United States and so on, being backed by the US. And the involvement, as I said a while ago, got deeper and deeper, worse and worse, messier and messier in Afghanistan. They could not win the thing, but they were there from 2001, when they got involved, right up to 2011. And later, of course, another phase, in the involvement in Afghanistan. Again, a lot of deaths, misery, suffering, and so on, which could have been avoided, except that the US, had this foolish idea that the Soviet Union was expanding its influence, and they decided even to back religious groups who they would, in the ordinary flow of events, they would have been against them. But here they backed them because they could use the power of religion against the communists. And they did that. But in the end, they failed. They could not succeed. And they had to pack up and leave. As we know, I think it was about 2021 when they were totally defeated and they had to leave. Then, there was Iran, right? Here again, 2003. They decided that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, that he was, basically, they felt he was a threat to Israel. It's true that Saddam Hussein was a firm, staunch backer of Palestine. People forget that, they forget the good deeds that he had done, Saddam, and he backed the Palestinians to the hilt. So what the Americans did at the behest of Israel, they moved in and decided that Saddam should be overthrown. So this whole myth about weapons of mass destruction and so on, and even though the weapons inspectors from the UN themselves, people like Scott Ritter, had shown that there were no weapons of mass destruction. There was no such program, but they moved in wanting to destroy the Soviet Union or its influence, and basically Saddam Hussein, who was a nationalist, yeah. He made mistakes, we don't deny that, but he was basically a nationalist, yeah. So the involvement in Iraq, another major mess. And if you look at what the costs were, more than 1 million people had died in Iraq after the US involvement. On both sides, if you put everything together, more than 1 million people had died. The US was also involved in Libya. The bombing of Libya, led by NATO, the US was at the forefront, wanted to get rid of Muammar Gaddafi, again, saying that he was a supporter of terrorism. But the basic thing was they didn't like this man, independent-minded guy, wanted to do things for his own people. He did some good things for his people, which we can't deny, including creating a river, a man-made river for the people, and bringing about other changes in agriculture, industry, and all the rest of it. So Libya, another example of a war which they created. And then, of course, you had Syria, long-term plan to get rid of Bashar Assad. Went on, and of course the Syria civil war began from 2014, as we know. And it went on for a number of years, that war. And in the end they succeeded in getting rid of Bashar Assad in 2025. And now they put up a guy who has got a background in Al-Qaeda, in politics, and who was a leader of the Al-Qaeda group. They're prepared to back anyone as long as they can achieve their own goals. So Syria, after Libya, before that Iraq, and so on and so forth. It has gone on, their involvement. So if you look at all the wars that we've been exposed to, that we've read about and we've witnessed, it's basically the US involved in all these wars for their own interests, or what they felt were their interests. And in the end, it becomes a very big mess. But the people who pay the price are the people of the land. Thousands, hundreds of thousands, sometimes even 1 million people who had been killed. And of course, the environment is destroyed, infrastructure is destroyed, and all the rest of it. So how can we talk about Iran being the cause of all these wars when we know that this is the reality? This is what had happened all along. The US is behind many of these wars and has brought about a lot of misery and suffering to people. I'm not saying that the United States is the only one. We know that the Soviet Union was involved in Afghanistan before the US. And it was a protracted war, and in the end, the Soviet Union was defeated by the Afghan people. And of course, they withdrew. I think in their case, it was from 79 to 89. They were there in Afghanistan. So that's another superpower that is involved. So it's superpower, big powers that are involved in things like this. And you can argue that, the Soviet Union at that time, before it collapsed, was involved in other little wars in Romania, in Czechoslovakia, Poland, so on. And that brings us to the present. If you look at what's happening in Iran, well, basically it is the same obsession that Iran is sponsoring terrorists, it's behind all the troubles in the region, all that, which of course is totally baseless. Yeah? Iran defends its own country. Iran is fiercely independent. They will not submit to the US. They are part of the resistance, it's true. And there are many groups that are allied to Iran as part of the resistance movement. Apart from the Houthis, who are both government and independent people's movement, you also have, of course, like Hezbollah and Hamas and all the rest, yes. But what are they doing? They're defending their own country. They're fighting against what they see as hegemony, attempts to control them and their destiny and their lives. That's what they are resisting. And it's not wrong. You defend your own land, your people, your rights. This is what they have been doing. And one has to ask oneself, and this is the final point I want to make, one has to ask oneself, why is it that all these movements linked to resistance, they are against Israel? Yes, they're against Israel because they see Israel as a state that was artificially created and imposed upon them, imposed upon the Arab people. That's the root of it. And it's true to some extent that this is a state that was created, as we know historically from the Balfour Declaration, and how Israel was created, linked to colonialism, British colonialism at the beginning, and later, of course, American colonialism. And this is what Israel is. Yeah? So don't talk about Iran being behind all this. Iran is resisting, and they will continue to resist. If it's not Iran, it will be someone else. They will resist because they want to defend their freedom and their independence. They don't want to be under Israel. If Israel thinks that it can achieve control over that region, West Asia, by playing this game, by trying to target countries that are independent, basically this is what they are unhappy about, Israel. Countries that are independent, they don't want to submit, they don't want to become slaves of Israel and the US. That's all. Now, I think it is Israel that has changed its mentality. You have to accept the fact that these are people fighting for their independence, and that'll go on forever. If there's no Hamas, if there's no Hezbollah, if there is no Ansar Allah, there will still be movements fighting against Israel, as long as Israel behaves like a hegemonic power or a subcontractor to a hegemonic power. As long as there's the US, hegemony, Israel, hegemony, these things will continue. So let us understand why wars are taking place. At the root of it is hegemony, dominance, control, wanting to direct and shape the lives of other people who are asking something very simple. They want freedom to shape their own lives, to determine their own destiny. Is that too much to ask? Thank you.